Well, he did tell us, didn't he, that he wanted to be dictator for a day. Is Donald Trump morphing into something rather more than that? A dictator for more than a day, in other words. Is there a constitutional crisis in the United States? Welcome to Americast from BBC News. Hello, it's Sarah here. I'm in our BBC bureau in Washington, and it's Anthony right here next to Sarah in our bureau. Hello, it's Justin in the worldwide headquarters of America in London, England, talking to you at around 3 in the afternoon on Thursday in the UK. Yeah, that makes it 10:15 in the morning here in Washington, D.C.H. And I have to warn you, Justin H. and everybody else who's listening, things are moving fast in Washington at the moment, and whichever story I'm covering for the 6 or the 10 SARS news changes several times during the day, so there's a possibility that the things we say in this podcast might be slightly out of date, might be slightly superseded by events by the time you're listening to it, but the gist of it will remain true, especially because we're talking about the executive orders that Donald Trump has been signing such a great flurry of, and whether governing by this means is actually damaging the U.S. Constitution and somehow circumventing all of the checks and balances that are meant to control his power. Yeah, we've seen a wide variety of different things Donald Trump has tried to do by executive order. He's tried to end birthright citizenship. That's the right of anyone born on U.S. soil to become a citizen. He started transferring migrants to Guantanamo Bay. He suspended asylum processing. He's ended the resettlement of refugees. He banned transgender care for people under the age of 19. He's offered all of these buyouts to federal workers, allowing them to essentially have an advance leave while getting paid, as long as they promise to resign by October. There's also a freeze on federal spending. There's a freeze on federal hiring. And then everything else Donald Trump has done to combat the diversity, equity, and inclusion DAI programs throughout the federal government. It's a remarkably broad scope of action that Donald Trump has taken unilaterally. Yeah, and Justin, as I'm sure you're well aware, a lot of these actions have then been challenged in court by the people who are affected by them. Yeah, and that's where it gets really interesting, isn't it? I mean, really interesting, because it's interesting as a kind of, just strikes me, if you're interested in the kind of academic side of politics, is interesting because, you know, what does the Constitution allow? What does it not allow, et cetera, et cetera? When is freedom curtailed? When is it extended? But also, this is actually real stuff that Anthony's just gone through. I mean, real things have a real immediate impact on real people. It's not academic at all. It really does matter whether he is allowed to do this stuff or not. And yeah, as you're saying, the judges in quite a few of these cases have blocked it, and at the moment seem to be on a collision course. So to give one example, the blocking of Doge, Elon Musk's sort of anti-big government task force, they've been banned from accessing sensitive U.S. Treasury data. And there was this response from the vice president himself, from J.D. Vance on X. He said if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general and how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's illegal. Judges, he said, are allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. It's a big statement, guys, isn't it, in every way? Yeah, and there's a lot of conversation here about whether or not we are entering some kind of US constitutional crisis. So I guess before we start debating the rights and wrongs of that, Anthony, are judges allowed to control the executive's legitimate power? Well, I mean, if you look at the way the federal government is structured, where the three co-equal branches, the judiciary, which is the courts, the executive, which is the president, and the legislative, which is Congress, they all have powers to check and balance each other. I mean, that's grade school level civics here in the United States, and so the courts do have a right and a responsibility to make sure that the laws that Congress pass are constitutional, that they comport with the founding document of this country. And then that when the president, the executive, takes those laws, that they accurately and correctly apply them and execute them, whether they're following the laws that Congress passes, and the courts have done this, for hundreds of years. So this is something that the courts have the power to do. What we're seeing here from listening to J.D. Vance is whether the executive can just decide to ignore the courts, and when the courts tell them this is illegal, you've got to stop. This, they go, well, make us, and they keep doing it. And that is where you get, at a constitutional crisis, a battle in tea. In the courts over whether what the president is doing is legal, has authority to do or not, a battle that works its way up through the federal judiciary to the appellate courts, and maybe ultimately the Supreme Court. That's kind of the way the government works. What we hear hints of from people like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance is that they don't want to play by those rules anymore. And if they do that, that's when you have the constitutional crisis that Justice Justin mentioned. And of course, it's the full scale of just how much they're doing and how fast they're doing it as well. It gives the impression that this is very, very different from how other presidents have executed their power. And I think this is a fascinating point because it's something we've hinted about, talked about before. It's the idea that there is on the American right, that the administrative state, that everyone who is in every kind of government bureaucratic institution, whether it's the people who are in charge of the parks or the people are in charge of us, aid around the world, or the people who do whatever they do for the government, that this has become a kind of an insulated CER of people who are basically, all of them, opposed to the Republicans, but specifically opposed to Donald Trump. And if you are not given the ability to get at them or to get rid of them, actually, at least in some cases, and possibly in many cases, then you don't have the power to govern that. That's the point they're making, isn't it? That's the kind of pushback against the idea that this is a kind of coup. They say the coup's already happened, and we're pushing back against that, right? People complain about Judes all the time and complain about court decisions all the time. You heard Joe Biden complain about the federal judiciary that was curtailing, for instance, his attempt to forgive student loans. Barack Obama complained all the time about single federal judges who were issuing national stays that suspended his immigration forgiveness, immigration policies to allow standardized or normalized status for people who are here as children illegally. All of that is not new. What's new is the hints from J.D. Vance and from Elon Musk and from other conservatives that maybe they don't have to play by those rules anymore. Although Donald Trump was asked about this when there was that rather surprise press opportunity where he and Elon Musk were answering questions rather together in the Oval Office, and he did say that they would abide by court rulings. And up until now they have, because quite a lot of this there's been the brakes put on some of his ideas by the court. So, for instance, sacking all the thousands of federal workers who work for USSAID, the aid organization that was stopped by the courts, the disbursement of all federal grants and loans that was stopped by the courts, and they haven't tried to carry on with it. I mean, they've abided by those court decisions. And Caroline Litt said the same thing in her press conference yesterday, that they were going to abide by the court decision and appeal it. Although Rhode Island, Judge the one who suspended the freeze on all government grants and loans, he said that the Trump administration is not abiding by his order, that their risk of being in contempt, that they need to release all these government funds, that they haven't done it fully yet. He didn't sanction the Trump administration. He has no punishments for them, yet hasn't held them in contempt yet. But that is one place where it looks like a judge is starting to get a little frustrated. Can I bring up Congress's role in all of this? Because you mentioned, right, the beginning, Anthony, 3 equal branches of government. Congress is an important branch of government. Congress, people, individual. Congress people regard themselves as very important. If you ever meet one, particularly a senator, you know that they regard themselves as very important, and yet in this they don't seem to be involved somehow. It just boggles the mind, doesn't it, that we've got this potential constitutional crisis going on, and yet they seem so supine. And the Republicans, of course, in charge, at least nominally in both houses, a lot of these things could be passed into law and then be much more difficult to challenge in the courts because they were laws of the land, but that's not happening. No, I think you're getting into something really interesting here, and that is that the Republicans are letting this happen. They have the majority in the House and the Senate. They could stop it if they want, and Donald Trump is intruding, as you mentioned, on congressional authority. But I think there are a lot of conservatives and a lot of Republicans in Congress who like what Donald Trump is doing. They've been trying to get rid of the Department of Education for decades. They've been trying to pare back federal spending for decades and cut back the federal workforce for decades, and they haven't been able to do it. Now, Donald Trump is actually finding a way, perhaps if the courts allow him to do it, and so the ends, like the means, maybe they're not so big a fan of, but for at least right now they're willing to go along with it because it's getting something done that they have been ramming their head into the wall over and over again on. Although, interestingly, in quite a few cases, the reason why the courts have stepped in and at least paused some of the executive actions that Donald Trump has signed is because the people bringing those cases have said it should be Congress that's doing this. You, as the president, don't have the power at the stroke of a pen. To, for instance, disband the whole of U.S. aid. It was created by Congress. It's funded by Congress. It needs to be disbanded by Congress. And in some cases, like firing all the inspectors general at various different departments, he ought to have notified Congress 30 days before he did that. And these are the reasons why it's being held up legally sometimes, because other people are sticking up for Congress, even if they won't stick up for themselves. What's the politics of all this? Because, I mean, there's a sort of strong guy ethic, isn't there? If I can put it like that, in the Trump administration, they've hit the ground running. They very much want us to be talking about how hugely energetic they are, and it seems to me that, in a sense, this plays into that, doesn't it, politically, and in terms of optics, this conflict with the courts is absolutely politically where they want to be. 100 SP every way you look at it. It seems to me it's got political upside. You clash with these lower courts and you say that these are activist judges who are standing in the way of Donald Trump's agenda, and that just shows you how the deep state H is out to prevent change. He looks extremely dynamic because he's taking all of these actions. Ultimately, these court cases will go up and up to higher and higher courts and end up in the Supreme Court, where if Donald Trump loses, well, at least he fought a valiant fight on behalf of what people elected him to do. He will say, but there's every chance he might win. We were all very surprised when the Supreme Court ruled last year that he, as president, he was the one who brought the case, had total immunity for any acts he took official. Acts he took as president, that he would not be criminally liable for any of that. They've given him very, very wide scope in the past. They might very well do so again. Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating case. And remember, as we talked about before, for 9 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court, 6 of them are conservative. 3 of those have been appointed by Donald Trump himself. So he only has to get 5 of the 6 conservative justices to support this vast expansion of presidential power in order to win. So it may be he's rolling the dice here, and he's not going to have to just ignore the courts, because when push comes to shove, the courts will ultimately be on his side. That could be the BET, and look at the coverage of it. So I think every day this week I've opened the New York Times, and the words constitutional crisis have appeared fairly prominently, and so there are howls of liberal outrage. Well, the Trump White House doesn't care about that. They're probably quite happy about that. The Wall Street Journal, some of the more right-wing papers, well, they're writing at length how ridiculous this liberal panic is, and how, yes, you could get to a constitutional crisis if the executive branch starts completely ignoring court rulings, especially if they try to ignore a Supreme Court ruling, but that we're nowhere near that yet. And could everybody please calm down a bit? We had a couple of emails on exactly these points. This is a good one from Andrew. For a country that seems to define itself and how it shook off the shackles of the British monarchy, it seems like they have a monarch with greater power than any modern monarch in Britain. The stroke of an executive order, Andrew says, seems to have all the power of a Tudor king, rather than a president working within checks and balances. It feels odd. He says that this centralization of power is accepted without comment. Well, it's not being accepted without comment, is it? But it is true, isn't it, Anthony Nether? It's an interesting question, the extent to which Americans actually want the kind of smack of firm government, and although they've invented all these checks and balances, and sometimes tell us how proud they are about the Constitution, that actually also they quite like something to be done just at the stroke of a pen. I think it reflects the frustration that many Americans feel about the system not working for them. The system has been gridlocked for a long time. Only very rarely do the different branches of government all kind of work in unison to make sweeping changes that many American people want. And so I think this is that frustration boiling over. Well, if Congress and the president can't seem to get along and nothing gets through Congress and everything gets tied up by the courts, well, maybe we should try having a stronger president who just rams all this through. Courts be damned, Congress be damned. And I think a lot of Americans will be happy with the end result if you look at polls right now. It's not the, oh my gosh, what is Donald Trump doing? He's tearing up the Constitution. You can see a plurality or close to it approving of Donald Trump and viewing him as someone who is taking decisive action, and they support that. And of course, toy about monarchy is a bit of a dirty word in America. They are very, very proud of the way they threw off the shackles of monarchy and invented an elective democracy instead. But of course, the difference between Donald Trump and AUD King is that he was elected and now he's taking all of these powers. But I guess if we're drawing those comparisons, if he's Henry VII, does that make Elon Musk Thomas Cromwell? Yeah, with all the ramifications later down the road that might bear it. Almost certainly does. We had another email as well, actually, which I think is worth getting to from Michelle, who says she's intrigued by the issue of the Constitution at the moment. Yes, Michelle, we all are. I think rightly. I mean, it is fascinating. As I was saying right at the beginning, it's fascinating the kind of rather dusty academic subject takes form in this way. Anthony's laughing, see you. He's interested in dusty academic subjects. But for the rest of us, Anthony, we're just waking up to your world, and it's brilliant. We're energized by. So she says, this is Michelle. She says, and many MAGA spokesmen have mentioned revisiting the Constitution as the checks and balances are hampering what they want. To do so, bearing in mind how devoted they are to the Constitution, or the right wing, is when it comes to the right to bear arms, the right of free speech as well. How can they now decide that the Constitution needs to be examined in relation to the areas they want to change? I mean, that's a very good question. You hear people talk about the First Amendment and First Amendment protections, and conservatives get very upset about what they see as infringement of free speech. But then on the flip side, you see some conservatives getting very upset when people on the left exercise their free speech and they take their own steps to try to control speech that they don't approve of. You saw Elon Musk on one hand doxing the daughter of a Rhode Island judge because of her employment at the Department of Education, but then Elon Musk bristling at the fact that there were reporters who were providing detailed information about these 19 to 21-year-old Doge employees who are going through the federal agencies and searching for, in his view, waste and saying that was illegal to provide public details about these folks. So it is a bit of a double standard. I will say something, Sarah, you mentioned, Donald Trump was elected, and that is something you hear from Trump and other conservatives time and time again. You heard from Elon Musk in that Oval Office visit and press conference he held a couple days ago, and that is that Donald Trump and the Trump White House are speaking for the American people, that they have the impar mature of the American people, and that Trump is doing what the American people voted for. And it is the courts, and it is Congress, and it is Democrats and the bureaucracy that are standing in the way of that. So, they are trying to present themselves as being accountable to the people in a way that their opponents aren't. I'm really intrigued by something in this question from Michelle. I mean, she's absolutely right that people, and I think on both sides of political argument, cling to the parts of the Constitution that support what they believe in and use them as a shield, and then can conveniently ignore other parts. But she's saying, what about MAGA's books? People talking about revisiting the Constitution, because although, it's just, and says it is a bit old and dusty, it's also malleable, isn't it? I mean, it has been changing. It wasn't just set in as when it was signed and hasn't changed since. Yeah, the bar for amending the U.S. Constitution is very high. Congress has to pass an amendment, and then states have to ratify it, and that takes a very long time. There's another method that we've never tried here. It is in the Constitution. But we haven't tried it, and that is to hold a new constitutional convention where the states call a constitutional convention, they send delegates, and everyone gets together, and they debate changing the Constitution, adopting new amendments to the Constitution. That's generally viewed by most people as a giant Pandora's box. As soon as you get that, who knows what's going to come out of it? And that's why people on the left sometimes talk about that, but they get worried about People on the right talk about it because, you get everyone together and who knows what the country would look like after they're done. But the very idea of talking about amending or revisiting the Constitution, that's not outrageous. That's not heretical in itself. I mean, as society moves on, as people have different ideas, sometimes the Constitution needs to keep up. Yeah, we have 29, 28 amendments already. So obviously it's been done a lot, sometimes done and redone. Like with prohibition, and there's an amendment, an equal rights amendment, that may or may not have been ratified at this point. Biden says it was, that would give women equal rights under the eyes of law enshrined in the Constitution. Enough. States ratified it, but there's a question if they waited too long to do it or not. But that shows you that it can happen. Amendments can happen. It just is a long, arduous process. And if they want to say, pass an amendment to allow Donald Trump to serve a third term, that would take time, probably more time than Donald Trump has it left in his second term. But the other thing that happens is that even without constitutional changes, there are changes in the way in which American government works, aren't there? And we talked for, I guess, decades really about presidential power and the accretion of power to the president in a way that the Constitution perhaps didn't initially envisage, but kind of seems to have happened. And you can see a sense, can't you, in which we have a different understanding post-Donald Trump of how much power the president should have. I mean, you think of that Supreme Court ruling pretty recently, Anthony, that said the president can't be prosecuted for things that he does within the orbit of his normal presidential duties. Those sorts of things do change life without necessarily the Constitution itself formally, in a formal way, being changed, right? The Supreme Court ultimately interprets the Constitution. They've kind of assumed that, right, for themselves, but they did it back in the early 19th century and has been that way ever since. And there was another big case that shows another example of how the Supreme Court can change the way the federal government operates. And that was the one also last year, that change, how courts defer to agency decisions they used to give a lot of deference to federal agency. So the federal bureaucracy, when interpreting laws that maybe aren't all that clear, and that had been the practice for since the early 1980s. So for 4 decades, the court last year changed it and said, no, federal judges are the ones who can step in and say the agencies are taking too much power for themselves. They're interpreting the law wrong. Even if the law is vague, they don't have to defer to the agencies. The judges can step in and say, no, this is what the law is. And it's going to be a pretty significant shift in the basis of power in this country, away from the bureaucracy and to the judiciary. And I think we're going to see the consequences of that, for decades to come. That's it for today. If you want to catch up with previous episodes, you can do it on UKK Sounds Bye Bye.